Hi, everyone. It's Natalie, and welcome back to the No-Till Market Garden podcast. For this episode, I talked with Ryan Fitzbeauchamp of Evening Song Farm in Vermont. Ryan and his wife, Kara, have an incredible story to get where they are today with a thriving year-round CSA. And yes, I did say year-round, and I did say Vermont. So for those of you who know Vermont, that is truly an impressive feat. I wanted to interview Ryan in part because they include what is often called rotational no-till on the farm. And this is a production system that is near and dear to my heart. And what I mean by rotational no-till is that they haven't eliminated tillage altogether, but they have dramatically reduced it and eliminated tillage prior to some crops. So this system is sort of a middle way. It's a way to get many of the benefits of no-till without either the herbicides associated with conventional no-till or the heavy mulch and other external inputs that many small-scale organic no-till farms rely on to get started. I had a great time talking with Ryan, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process, so make sure to check them out. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmer's Friend. In a world where the threat of food insecurity is quickly becoming the new norm, Farmer's Friend exists to equip, educate, and inspire growers to change the world through regenerative agriculture. Small farms are the future, and the future is now. If you need quality tools and supplies for your vegetable or flower operation, check out their growing selection of innovative and affordable tunnels, tools, tarps, and much more. Here at my home farm, we rely heavily on Farmer's Friend for our production. We have 3 of their Caterpillar tunnels. We use the silage tarps for occultation. Their row covers have gotten us through hard winters. And of course, the Quick Cut Greens Harvester has sped up our baby greens harvest tremendously. Visit farmersfriend.com/no-till today. That's farmersfriend.com/no-till. Or visit the link in the show notes and get free shipping on your entire order. All right, enjoy the show.
Hi, Natalie. Well, thanks for having me on. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Ryan Fitzbeauchamp, and my wife, Kara, and I, and our 6 or 7 employees run Evening Song Farm in Shrewsbury, Vermont.
And could you describe your farm today?
Our farm, we manage a vegetable farm. We sell mostly through CSA. It started beginning in 2020. We became predominantly a CSA farm. And we have about 4 acres of production. That includes 3 30 by 148 high tunnels.
And describe how you got started.
So let's see, our farm, we got started back in, I suppose, Kara and my, our introduction in market gardening was back in 2009. We had, it was our second year out of college. And
were you college sweethearts? Can I ask you that?
We were, yeah.
Okay.
Kara and I, we met when we were 18, and then our relationship started when we were 20. And somehow, I don't know how really, because it was unexpected to both of us, but we managed to stay together through a lot. So very grateful for that.
So 2009.
So in 2009, we had the opportunity to stay with some family friends of Kara's at Journey's End Farm in Pennsylvania. That was a farm camp, and they were looking for some help in the off season when they didn't have a big staff to take care of the farm animals that they had for camp and the other maintenance and maple sugaring that they did. So we helped out in the off season, and in the summer they gave us use of their land and some equipment that they had to manage a market garden. So our very first year there, we started with 3/4 of an acre. And for us, it was just kind of a low-risk little experiment that we were privileged to get to try out. And it went well the first year. We really enjoyed it. And that was when we decided that I think this is what we want to try to do for a career. So we put in one more year there at Journeys on Farm, and then in 2010 we purchased land in Vermont, in Rutland County, on Route 103 along the Mill River, and had our first season there in 2011 with a small. That first year we sold at 3 farmers markets and had a CSA of about 50 people or so, and sold to some restaurants, and really just kind of tried to do it all right from the beginning, growing on about 2.5 acres.
Did you have a connection to Vermont? Why did you choose Vermont?
Well, the year before, our first year out of college, we had lived in Hardwick, Vermont, and so that was kind of our first place to look, was around Hardwick. We had some friends and connections in that area, but just weren't able to find land that would work for us that was affordable. So it was just so happened that when we were driving back from looking at a few places up in Hardwick, we stopped and visited a friend of ours who was living in the town of Shrewsbury at the time temporarily. So we stopped and visited and had a nice little visit. And then on our way back to where we were living in Pennsylvania, we happened to drive by the place that we ended up purchasing. It was right on the highway, and a beautiful flat piece of land with an old fixer-upper farmhouse and an old useful barn, and right on the river. It was just a beautiful spot and affordable, and it was a great opportunity.
So how did early climate change disaster affect your perspective on soil health and land stewardship?
So in that first year growing on that piece of land, it was a big learning curve for us. We hadn't grown, we went from 3/4 of an acre to 1 acre, all of a sudden growing on 2.5 acres, and using some new equipment and limited experience managing a vegetable operation. So it was a big learning curve for us to jump up to that and have the weight of all this responsibility and a mortgage, and it was not, a lot of the risk was removed from the equation when we started out our first couple of years, but then all of a sudden it felt very risky for us to be doing what we were doing on a new piece of land. And then as that summer went on, we started to feel like we were getting our feet under us and developing our markets and getting the hang of it, and feeling really grateful for the opportunity to be doing what we were doing in spite of the challenges that first year. In late August of that first year, when Tropical Storm Irene came through Vermont, the Mill River that we were on that day overflowed its banks, and we saw it start to flow onto our fields before we evacuated ourselves to higher ground. And then when we saw our fields the next day, the river had carved a new path for itself right through the fields that we were growing on. And we had the land that we were on there was a kind of a bend in the river, and the river curved to go around our property. And then with the force of the water during Tropical Storm Irene, just redirected that river to go straight through our land.
And I would encourage people to go to your website and check out the photos, because it's hard to imagine without seeing the visuals exactly what you're talking about.
It was really something. I think one of the things about the river that we were on is that we're up at a high elevation, and the river's fed by a lot of mountain streams. It's a higher velocity river, and so the type of flooding that we experienced wasn't an inundation flood where the water rose up and settled back down and deposited a lot of sediment from the slow-moving water receding. This was a fast-moving river that really scoured the ground that we were growing on, and off on the edges deposited some piles of sand off on the edges of our fields, but mostly it was a scouring event that just removed all the topsoil and left a riverbed of a lot of rocks and moving water through it. And that was just seeing that for the first time was just unlike anything we could have imagined. I remember when we were packing up and leaving, seeing the water over our fields, just kind of hoping that, maybe we would be able to come back and that the damage wouldn't be too bad. But even when we left, it was, it was just unimaginable to me, in my inexperience, understanding how powerful water can be. It was just unimaginable to me to see the type of destruction that there was.
Yeah, and that happened all over Vermont, right? I mean,
I don't
maybe
know
not
of
so
any
much
other vegetable farms,
but
that
just
that experience the type of I don't know, I guess maybe the thoroughness of removal of scouring that we experienced, but certainly so many roads and a lot of land was scoured away in similar ways.
So what did you do?
Well, we what did we do? We just kind of went one day to the next for a while. There was just one of the things that was so useful for us, or very fortunate, was that we were so visible. We were right on a state highway. And so many people had seen, before we were there, it was kind of a fallow meadow. The people before us had, stored, lumber and tires, and, there was it was not exactly a junkyard, but the land wasn't used productively before us. And so it was, so many people went back and forth to work past our place and saw us out there early in the morning and late in the evenings, and saw this little piece of land transform into a sweet little vegetable farm. So, and I think for so many people, it was just so heartbreaking to see what happened. And a lot of what we did those first few days was just kind of receive the generosity of so many people who stopped by and were so heartbroken at what they saw. And then, we looked into any kind of assistance that might be available, which there was, but there was also a lot of dead ends looking for assistance.
Was it immediately? Were you thinking like, oh, we can rebuild this, or were you thinking this is not going to happen?
I think one of the biggest things. I guess I'm trying to think. I don't even know how I thought about it early on. I think it just sort of seemed impossible at the very beginning. But just within a few days of people coming by and spending time with us and sharing their thoughts and feelings with us, I think it felt a little bit like there wasn't, I don't know, maybe almost like we just needed to keep going, and like there wasn't an option. It just seemed like there was just so much generosity from our community. It felt like, I think part of it felt like that was a way that we could aspire to give back to this community that helped us out so much when we were so new to this place. And I think for me, I think partly it felt like it began to feel like this is what that was what I wanted to do. Like it felt like I wanted to put the energy in to try to grow from that, unimaginably difficult setback.
Yeah. So when you did end up looking for new land, and when you were doing that, how did this experience make you think about that differently? What were you looking for?
Let's see. I mean, certainly, I think we weren't going to. It was kind of a non-starter to find land along the same river. There was a very similar piece of beautiful flat land just right down the road from us that we chose not to pursue. It received much less damage during Irene, but along the same river, and so that was certainly a non-starter. I think the thing that we didn't have the experience to appreciate is, I think one of the quotes that I remember from that time that I looked into and really stuck in my head was a Wendell Berry quote that I don't have it in front of me, but the way I remember it is along the lines of that the soil is not usually lost in magnificent slabs of huge tonnage, but it's lost over a little bit at a time by thousands of careless acts. And I remember thinking about that and thinking how unusual it was for us to have the opportunity to see land being lost in magnificent slabs through that event. And I think it was really only over time, later, that seeing that huge transformation of land, I think one of the things I learned from it was how malleable land is. And I didn't really have an appreciation for the geologic scale of change, and how those changes often happen, maybe once in a lifetime, or that kind of on that very slow scale, but they do happen. And then similarly, so the piece of land that we ended up that we were able to eventually purchase and move our business to, it's away from a river, but in contrast to our first piece, it is on a slope. Mm-hmm. So it's really, and it's an interesting contrast, because we have a piece of land that is not vulnerable to that sudden incredible erosion that we did experience, but in contrast is vulnerable to the kind of little bit at a time erosion that is much more common.
Yeah. So how has that kind of led to the evolution of your production practices from so that was 2012 when you moved to new land, or 2013?
2012 is when we started growing, the very next year.
So you've been there 10 years.
That's right.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that you were able to keep farming, and it's really like heartwarming to hear that you had such community support to keep you going, because that is a pretty traumatic event.
I really feel so lucky about the whole thing, and it's remarkable to me, that there's just how we ended up where we are and how we were able to make it through, and so I feel so grateful for that, and at the same time, I also feel like I don't know if I could do that all over again. Yeah. I think it was just like, it's incredible that we were able to get from there to here. But it was also, especially the first few years, was just so hard, and so much energy to restart and to develop all of our infrastructure from scratch, and really to kind of be thrust into this, into a position of putting so much energy out for a goal in the future, but not, having it takes so long to be able to kind of taste the fruits of all that energy that's putting out, and for a long time, it just kind of felt like a bottomless pit of just sort of building and building and building to try to get to this place that we hoped could then work a little bit better for our life.
So how has that looked in terms of, your business, but also just how you've dealt with the sloping land and the soil health on your new, 10-year-old property?
Yeah.
And I guess I should put out there too that so you and I, we've never met in person, but we've met on email and on get Zoom conferences and stuff, because you actually reached out to me, which was, as a researcher, that is like the awesomest thing when farmers actually reach out and are like, hey, I like what you're doing. So I just wanted to put that out there too.
That's right. Yeah. And I'm so thankful for the work that you've done. It's been one of the things that has helped us in our goals of kind of becoming better stewards of our soil on this piece of land. And that's really been a huge learning curve for us, partly because we're first generation farmers and have, came to this with a limited experience. And so it's meant that we've had to learn. A lot of our learning has been learning by making mistakes. And so I guess I can talk about some of the mistakes that we made when we started growing on this new piece of land, and how we've learned from them and how we've adapted from that, both from learning from mistakes and also learning from opportunities like the research that you've done, Natalie.
Yeah.
So when we started growing here, we used the same equipment that we had been using on our first piece of land, and that equipment was reasonably well adapted to that flat sandy soil that we were growing on. But we had used tractors and had been making plowing our fields and making raised beds and disking it in when we were done with the crop. And so we used that same equipment here on our sloping land, and within that very first year, we soon realized that the raised beds that we were making on a slope were leading to erosion of our soil. And so after that first year, we realized, okay, this isn't going to work in this situation, and we did some research into other alternatives that we could do that would better control erosion. And then for a few years, we switched to a different system where we had permanent sod pathways in between our beds. So we had a 4-foot wide rototiller on our tractor that would prepare our beds, and then we had about a 2-foot sod pathways in between every bed that we maintained with a walk-behind string trimmer. And that helped quite a bit. Our beds went across the slope, and so every 4 feet there was a bed to grow vegetables or cover crops in, and then in between there was this 2-foot sod pathway. And there are some farms that seem to be successful with similar systems. For us, it was great because at first it definitely did help us in our goal of controlling erosion compared to the raised beds that we had been using before. But that system also came with a handful of production challenges and soil health management challenges that led us to want to improve on that system. And so some of the production challenges that we experienced were weed management, especially the perennial weeds that were in the pathways in between the beds. We hadn't completely removed quackgrass from our fields before we implemented the system. And so then the pathways became kind of this space where quackgrass rhizomes could grow and sustain themselves and continually creep into the beds. So that became a challenge that made it, especially over time, became a little bit harder and harder for us to manage the quackgrass that would be able to persist in the pathways and really didn't give us an opportunity to flush out of our soil. And then similarly, it was just the edges. The system had so many edges. Every single bed was edged by sod. And so in addition to just the quackgrass, those edges are just difficult spaces to manage. The rototiller would kick some soil over into the pathways, and there would be annual weeds growing in the pathways, and with the opportunity to set seed below the level of the mower. And so it just wasn't. We began to realize that it wasn't a particularly efficient system. We did use some landscape fabric on beds, which worked well, but at the same time, it was it just became a lot of landscape fabric, and it wasn't that enjoyable for our crew to manage that much landscape fabric. And it's also just a certain amount of work to pick it up and put it down. And there's certain crops that it works really well for, but we had kind of been overusing it for crops that it wasn't as effective for.
You were leaving it down the whole season, like you had holes in it and you would plant the crops into it. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we used it for many of the crops that were commonly used for, tomatoes and peppers and those crops that are common. But then we also were using it for other less valuable crops like broccoli or cabbage or things like that, because it was effective at managing the edges in the system that otherwise were difficult to manage.
Right. And
it's just for our farm, it was just too much to manage all that landscape fabric for all those crops. Some even shorter season ones like broccoli and of lesser value. So those were some of the production challenges. And then similarly, we experienced a lot of soil health challenges kind of increase over time. The land that we started growing on, where we are now, had been a mowed field for the past 50 or 60 years. So we started with soil that was fairly high in organic matter, and had decent soil structure early on from all the organic matter at the surface of the soil. And within a few years, we began to see that soil structure deteriorate, and our soil became a lot more powdery and would crust more. Mm-hmm. And it was mostly just from the fact that this system required us to do a lot of rototilling in it. So the beds were maintained with a rototiller, and they just received a lot of passes. So, a few passes to prepare the bed, and a few passes to turn the crop in. So some, multiple passes of a rototiller year after year, and we began to notice our soil structure deteriorate. And similarly, the system didn't give us. It was just hard to manage annual weeds in the system. We didn't really have any. We had limited tools for managing annual weeds, and we noticed over time this, from our fields had been in sod for so long, so a lot of we started with a very low annual weed seed bank, and that began to build up and up and up over time, and it quickly became a threat to the viability of our farm business.
Yeah.
And then really the final thing that was a soil health challenge in the system was that while erosion management was improved, we still did experience erosion within the system. And I came to understand that the big challenge, the obstacle to erosion control in the system was the fact that we had these very long fields that when that water would run down, would run over these fields for a very long time and would increasingly become channelized the farther down the field it went. Mm-hmm. And so there were these very long runs where water was able to channelize itself. And it did have, it had these sod pathways every 4 feet that would prevent it from making huge gullies. But nonetheless, there were these huge runs where water could run down, and we were still experiencing erosion within the system. So as we were trying to address some of these production and soil health challenges within the system, like many other farms of our scale, we started implementing some tarps, and there was a couple of years where we managed more and more of a hybrid system where we had some sod pathways, and we also tarped some whole areas, maybe 40-foot wide areas that we would tarp.
And what was your scale at this point when you started doing this? How many acres were you growing on?
About the same as it is now, 3.5 to 4 acres. So we had this little hybrid system for a while where some beds we would manage as with permanent sod pathways. Other areas we would tarp to try to take advantage of some of the weed control opportunities with tarping. And it was the tarping was I was really happy with that, and it was neat to see the effects of it, and also to have some of these areas where we didn't have this sod interface all the time and where we had better weed control, seemed like a promising aspect of the system. But the challenges with that were when we tried to turn these tarp areas back into beds with sod pathways and seed grasses to reestablish the sod pathways, we would get a lot of annual weeds coming up in there, and we weren't able to effectively manage our annual weed seed bank when we were kind of going back and forth between tarping and permanent sod pathways. And similarly, the tarping was really great for production, and we liked that, but taking out those sod pathways did, of course, make our soil more vulnerable to erosion with the long runs that we had. So with a couple years of trying out that system, we finally realized that the underlying challenge with erosion management was these long runs that we had. And so what we ended up doing to address the soil health challenges and also the production challenges was to really map out our fields into 40-foot wide sections that could be the size of the tarps that we use to make these kind of modular sections that can be tarped. And in between them, there's a 10-foot wide swale that runs across the slope of the field. And that swale, as water, if we get any intense rains where water begins to run off of the field, the maximum amount that water is able to travel is 40 foot down the length of that little field until it goes into a swale and runs across the slope of the field off of our production area.
And you actually built those swales?
Yeah, we hired an equipment operator to. We had it all marked out, and we hired an equipment operator to install them across our farm. And that was a big step to take, and we put a lot of thought and intention into the design of it, and planning out where the water would go. And I found, and we're really happy with the results of it. It's allowed us to. It feels like the best solution for us to be able to intensively crop vegetables on sloping land, while being able to develop efficient production systems and also being able to manage our soil health well.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by Tilth Soil. This Cleveland, Ohio-based company is producing some of the highest quality potting mixes out there. One of the biggest lessons I learned in farming is the importance of good seed starting mixes, and that's why I included Tilth Soil in my book and have been using their seed starting mix, Sprout, on my farm since 2020. Tilth Soil produces potting mixes approved for use in organic operations like our own. Their living soil is made with fully composted food waste they collect and process themselves. Whether you need a cubic yard super sack once a year or ongoing deliveries for your year-round operation, Tilth has you covered. The team at Tilth can help with shipping, coordination, and provide ongoing support throughout the growing season. To learn more, visit www.tilthsoil.com. That's tilthsoil.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by Real Organic Project. Does your farm deserve to be recognized for all the hard work done on behalf of the environment and your community? Real Organic Project is an add-on certification that partners with 1,000 plus certified organic farms across North America, including my own farm, Rough Draft Farmstead. Available at no cost to farmers and with minimal time commitment, it is a great way to differentiate your farm from mass-marketed corporate organic, where hydroponic production and animal confinement are still commonplace. Real Organic Project is a whole farm certification program to distinguish crops grown in healthy soils and livestock raised humanely on pasture. As a farmer-led movement, we know many hands make for quick work. I hope you will lend yours by signing up for Real Organic Project certification today. Visit realorganicproject.org/no-till to apply. That's realorganicproject.org/no-till to apply. All right, back to the show.
So how did cover cropping fit into your system before? And then, could you talk a little bit about the high residue cover cropping system?
Yeah. So before in our old system of permanent sod pathways, we would just cover crop single beds, and then maybe we'll just talk about high residue cover crops like rye and vetch. So we would plant those in a single bed. We would, while the cover crop was growing, we would mow the pathways in between to try to keep the pathways from setting seed, the sod pathways, and then when the cover crop was mature, we would mow it. And then for a high residue cover crop like rye and vetch, we would do a lot of tillage to be able to prepare that area to plant into. So there would be all this residue that, that we'd feel great about having all this biomass to turn into the soil, but we didn't have a great way of incorporating it to be able to plant a crop into there. So we would, be several passes with a chisel plow and a rototiller to be able to make that bed plantable. And so what was a great opportunity in the new system that we have, where instead of having a 4-foot wide bed to work in, we have 40-foot wide blocks, is for our late fall cover crops, we planted we plant rye or rye vetch mix in those zones and let them grow to maturity. And then inspired by the research that you've done, as well as some other farms that implemented the system before us, or similar system before us, we now let that rye grow as big as it can until the pollen shedding stage. And at that point, we flatten the rye. There's any number of ways that it can be done, but we just float the bucket of our tractor and drive over those fields to flatten the rye, going all the same direction. And then we cover it with a tarp. And we tarp the rye as short as 10 days or as long as or until we're ready to plant. And then when that rye when we're ready to plant in that zone, we take the tarp off. The rye is completely killed at that point, and then we plant directly through the residue. So that's kind of the short summary of the system. And there's just a lot of we can go into any little details of lots of little things that we've learned from a few years of doing this, and a lot of research that you've done too that we can go into.
Yeah, let's spend a little bit of time on this. So I would love to know what lessons you've learned, and I know we've talked about some of them, and just, short history for everyone else out there. I actually did my dissertation on this system, which is, I don't know, it's kind of funny, but when I was done with my dissertation, I said, I'm never going to talk about that again. And here I am talking about it. So I guess I can never really get rid of it. But
how come? Were you just so tired of it?
Yeah, I was so tired of it. Yeah. I enjoy, and I actually still have to write one more paper. So I'm not totally done with it. But yeah, I don't know. Working on something that long, it's, I don't know, kind of wipes you out. But
wow.
So I started working on this system in 2015. It was funny because I had just started my PhD, and I had some ideas about things I wanted to study, but I wasn't completely sure. And there was an undergrad who approached me and said, I want to work on some no-till vegetable stuff. And I had done no-till vegetable stuff for my master's. And I was like, I want to do something different. And, nothing against no-till vegetables. But so he had some ideas. He said, I want to do this like roller crimping rye and vetch. And, I was up on the literature enough to know that in New Hampshire, we can't really grow rye and vetch and then crimp it and then expect to grow no-till vegetables. Like, you can't get high enough biomass. There's going to be weeds. It's not really that effective to terminate vetch unless, you wait until like mid to late July or something, which is too late for most people. So there were some issues with this, like just roller crimping a cover crop and then planting into it, which is, what they may be able to do in Maryland, but we couldn't do it here. And so I said, all right, well, let's try to do it, but let's include tarps, because at that time, there was a big sort of movement using tarps. And so I said, let's look at like clear tarps and black tarps, and let's just see how it goes. And so we did this little research project, and it was really interesting. There were some kind of thought-provoking initial results. And so then I said, all right, well, let's apply for a grant. And we got a grant. And so then there was money. And so then I said, okay, well, I guess this is my dissertation. So that's what I ended up doing. And we designed a couple of different experiments. One kind of just proof of concept. Does this work? How does it affect yields? And we looked at cabbage. And then the other one was really like, how do we optimize this in terms of how long we let the cover crops go, how long we leave the tarps on. And then what was really great was that like I could do that kind of research, but I was not at the farm scale implementation. So then like when you contacted me and said, all right, this is all well and good, but how do I actually transplant these vegetables? And so that's where like really taking this system from proof of concept to farm scale implementation. That's kind of the history on my side of it. And what have you learned through your years of actually doing this for real, not just for research?
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful that you did that research and also presented on it. I remember seeing your presentation at the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association annual meeting, and took a lot of notes on it and thought, wow, this sounds like a really interesting thing to try. And it's one of my favorite things that we do on our farm. And I think it feels like I guess it's one of those things where it just growing in this way just feels great. It just feels so good to be able to grow a crop and to be able to grow these huge, beautiful cover crops, and then to be able to plant right through it and to see these plants growing with so much residue on the soil, and to see our soil cared for in that way. I think, so much of growing vegetables intensively is, it can often feel a little bit like like inflicting the least amount of damage. And this just growing with this system feels like it's like we're really getting to take care of our soil in the best way while we're also producing a crop. So yes, I'm grateful that you did this and shared it with the farming community. And so for what we've you were asking what we've learned?
Yeah, what you've learned just about the sort of practicality of implementing the system, like, how heavily do you seed your cover crops? What are you using to transplant your crops? Which crops are you using in this system? What have you observed about fertility and moisture? Yeah,
there's so many things. It's interesting because it's simultaneously a very simple system. Like it really is very easy. But I suppose like anything in agriculture, there's also a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
And little details to be familiar with. So our very first year, we started with a single zone, 40 feet by 120 feet, or about a tenth of an acre, which is a great scale to start on. And I think if anyone is considering implementing a system like this, I think it's really it's just try it out on a tenth of an acre and see how it goes. So as far as I think the crops that are grown in here, that's a good place to start, because that is because the crops that you can grow in this system are limited. by the fact that there's very high residue in the soil, and so it's not practical to transplant crops that are spaced very closely together, like head lettuce or things like that. It works better for transplants that are spaced a little farther apart, just for the practicality of getting these plants in the ground. At least in our system, there may be ways of getting around that. The other limitation is that you have to let the rye and vetch grow to maturity. So for us, we're tarping them in the first or second week in June. And then the tarp needs to stay on the field for at least 10 days to kill the rye and vetch. And so the very earliest that a transplant can get in the ground is the middle of June. If all goes well, and it's a safer bet is to plan on transplanting in early July. So that for us, that pretty much limits this system to fall brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, Napa cabbage, kale, and storage kohlrabi is another crop we've grown in the system. Rainbow chard is another, not a brassica, but a similar kind of fall green. And also late successions of cucurbits like zucchini and cucumbers.
I'm really interested to hear you say that, and we can either talk about it now or get back to that, because that's actually the first I've heard of somebody using it for cucurbits.
Yeah, we've just zucchini. It works great for zucchini. We've grown really nice fall zucchini that we harvest late into the season with the system. Usually our first planting kind of peters out in late August, and it's nice for our CSA where we like to have a lot of diversity of stuff, and zucchini and squash continues to be popular into September. It's worked great for that. Cucumbers the past 2 years have been, they physically can work in the system, but the plants have not thrived the way that the zucchini plants have. So I think we would probably abandon the effort of growing cucumbers in the system. But I don't think it's necessarily anything inherent in the system.
Do you think that's because something about the cucumbers, do you think it's a temperature thing or like a root system thing, or?
I really have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know. They just, it may be a root system thing. It's interesting because one of the things with the system is that it's the first time we did it, it feels a little scary to plant into it because I'm so used to planting into well-prepared soil, and I've seen what happens when I've tried to plant into soil that's not well prepared, and it feels like you're planting into the most unprepared soil that I've ever planted into. Because there's just all this dead residue, and the soil is not light and fluffy, and and so when our crew plants into this, every time we've done it, it always feels like, is this going to work? Are these plants going to grow in here? Yeah. And it's remarkable. One of the things I like to do when I plant anything is just check on the roots a few days later, 5-6 days after planting, and just observe how vigorously the roots are adapting to the new environment that they're transplanted into. If there's bright white new roots that are growing into the soil, or if conversely the plant has kind of abandoned its old root system and is starting over from scratch, cautiously sending out a few little shoots. I find that that's one of the ways that I can tell early on how, just get a sense of what to expect for a crop, and if attention might be needed. And also just to try to understand a little bit more what is helpful for plants to really take into the environments that they're transplanted in. And it's amazing with this system how I don't know what it is about it, but the brassicas in particular that we plant are just, they always grow roots so quickly and vigorously into the no-till soil, even though it seems like, oh, I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's I wanted to talk to you about is I think, a lot of the folks who have started 100% no-till, continuous no-till farms or market gardens, they have really heavy compost inputs. And so they have sort of created a topsoil that is very light and fluffy, and they are able to, transplant anything into it very easily. And it feels like what you were talking about in terms of that, you said like nice, well prepared, which I love, because that's such a like value laden statement, like a well prepared soil. But so and what you're saying is that like, yeah, this soil it's still hard. Like it feels, it's a weird feeling the first time you kind of do something in a no-till soil that is not a sort of augmented, light, fluffy, composted soil, but yet it still works. And I have also observed that, and I think that when I was doing the research, we actually just used like a tree dibbler, a stand-up tree dibbler, and we'd poke a hole, and it was the perfect size for just a 72. And I wouldn't even, like, I would literally just drop it in the hole and then just like push it down a little bit. And just that was enough for that transplant to the roots to make contact with that soil and just like immediately start growing. And like you said, they just do awesome. Yeah.
I think the nature of the, of the disconnect maybe is the difference between what feels like compact soil when you're transplanting to what is actually compact soil when you measure it with a penetrometer.
Yeah.
And, our like plant roots, I've learned that, up to 200 PSI can grow really well. And then 200 to 300 PSI, it's a little more marginal, and above 300 PSI, plant roots generally don't grow. But that threshold is just so higher than what our fingers are used to for transplanting into something.
Yeah.
So if you were to test the soil that we plant into with a penetrometer, it's very free of compaction. But if you go down beneath this, rye residue and try to make a hole to plant into, you can't do it easily.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing about it too is that, and I think it'd be important to talk a little bit about moisture management, but as long as you have moisture in the soil going into your transplanting, then that residue really keeps the moisture in there, and the plants just thrive. And so the moisture content is a big part of whether plant roots are able to get through the soil, because it's much easier to get through a moist soil than it is to get through a dry soil.
And it's really remarkable how effective that grown in place mulch is at moisture retention. I remember this year there was kind of one we were in the middle of doing our big fall brassica transplant through our rye, and we had finished planting our Brussels sprouts, and we moved on to, there was a little bit of time left in the end of the day, and I thought, well, why don't we just we'll start planting our red cabbage, and we'll come back and finish it up probably tomorrow. And so it was this random little happenstance thing where we planted a single row of red cabbage and weren't able to come back and finish it up tomorrow. And I wasn't able to, I didn't prioritize moving our irrigation on that one row of red cabbage. It was like normally when I transplant in the system, unless we're getting rain, I'll put irrigation on it right away just to give the plants every opportunity to thrive in their transition. But it was remarkable in a heat spell in early July, having these seedlings just get baked for about a week before we transplanted the rest of the zone. And I assumed that we'd just have to rip those plants out and plant again. But when I looked at the roots of a few of them, with no rain in extremely unideal transplanting conditions, they had grown roots incredibly well. through the system. And so the moisture retention from the mulch is really a huge thing, like you're saying.
Yeah, from the mulch and just from not tilling too, and keeping
Exactly.
that aggregation. Yeah. I did want to talk also about fertility management in the system. I know that a lot of folks have sort of learned one of the reasons why you want to maybe terminate rye a little bit earlier is because if you let it grow too long, then it becomes this, very high seed-to-end ratio material, and it can immobilize nutrients. So what has been your experience? And you actually have some numbers on this too.
Yeah, I was fortunate to kind of develop this system. In addition to being inspired by your research, I had Becky Madden from the UVM extension, who I got to work with fairly closely to implement the system and to do some investigation into nitrogen availability within the system. And let's see, let's see. I guess the first thing that I was curious about was how do you manage nitrogen in the system? Because it's so different from what I'm used to doing of, soil testing and applying, looking at the crop that we're growing and applying enough nitrogen to meet the crop needs and mixing it into the soil. In this system, there's not an opportunity to mix fertilizer into the soil, and so I was curious. Well, how is that going to work? Can I just broadcast the poultry manure fertilizer that we use on top, and is that actually going to do anything, or am I just or not? So the first year, Becky and I looked at fertilizer that we broadcast, and so at the point where the rye was flattened, so we would flatten the rye, broadcast fertilizer, cover with a tarp, and then we would take soil samples throughout the growing season to look at the nitrate availability in the soil. And what we found is that fertilizer broadcast on top of the rye and tarped becomes really rapidly available, and you start from the time you transplant, you start with a very high nitrate availability that over the course of the season kind of slowly winds down. And so out of maybe fear that the nitrogen, our fertilizer wouldn't become available without being incorporated, I had over applied nitrogen that first year. I think I put on a very high application rate of 150 pounds per acre, and perhaps unsurprisingly, but found that we had really high nitrate, excessive nitrates when we were planting our crops into it. About 75 parts per million when we needed much less than half that amount to get started. So that was I guess that was the first lesson learned, is that broadcasting fertilizer and tarping in this no-till system, the nitrogen really does become available, and so we could cut way back down on our fertilizer rates. The second year that Becky and I worked together on this past season, I wanted to follow up on an idea that Becky had of banding fertilizer right in the row instead of broadcasting it across the bed. And so we did a little more detailed trial where we had 7 different treatment zones. One zone that had no fertilizer at all applied, and then three zones of, I believe it was 50 pounds, 100 pounds, and 150 pounds nitrogen per acre broadcast. And then the last 3 treatment zones were the same nitrogen amounts, 50, 100, 150 pounds per acre, but they were banded in the row instead of broadcast. And I don't have those PSNTs, the nitrogen tests have trickled in. I don't remember. I don't have those results compiled and organized.
What did you observe for what crop were you growing?
Brussels sprouts.
And what did you observe as far as yields?
The first thing that was noticeable was that even in a rye vetch mix, not applying nitrogen led to stunted crop growth. The control, we called that our control bed, was noticeably smaller and more stunted with less yield than the other beds. And the other very obvious thing that we noticed was that the banded fertilizer looked really good. It took a very small amount of nitrogen banded in the row to get really excellent crop response. 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre banded looked just as good as 150 pounds broadcast.
Wow. Yeah. And whereas before you were just sort of generally assuming, okay, I need 150 pounds and applying that.
Yeah, I guess that kind of came out of a skepticism that nitrogen would be available to the plants from fertilizer that was just sitting on top of this straw.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe I missed this, but you ended up applying that fertilizer before you applied the tarps or after you applied the tarp, after you removed the tarps?
Before we applied the tarps.
Okay.
So and I think that's probably a bit, my guess is that it's probably a key in what made it available is having 2 to 6 weeks of this very humid environment underneath the tarps that I'm guessing it was catalyzed the breakdown of those nitrates, and similarly the tarp being over the beds, preventing any leaching or denitrification, just kind of keeping it right in there until the tarp was removed.
Yeah. I did want to touch briefly. Well, I realized that we missed talking about your transplant. Well, it's not a transplanter, but about your slit maker. We didn't talk about that. And then I also want to talk about what sort of supported your research. But could you talk about the equipment that you worked on?
Sure. So the very first year where we tried this at 1/10 of an acre, we grew broccoli that first year in this system, and was really impressed with everything about it. The weed control was outstanding, and the broccoli yields were really good, and the soil coverage was excellent. It was just like, wow, this is an awesome system that we tried out. But the one piece that we realized would need to be improved in order to scale up the system was the ease of transplanting in our soil. And so we tried a handful of things that first year of, pulling strings across the field to mark our rows and measuring out the distance between plants. And we tried, bulb augers and I don't even remember a number of things to get these broccoli transplants into the ground, and it just took a really long time for us in the soil that we have.
End up with a workers' comp claim about wrists and
or at least an unhappy crew. And if we were to scale that up, it just would not have been. I don't know. It's so important on our farm to minimize the amount of work that people don't like doing, and it was really not a pleasant task. Even with all the benefits, that it was like, you don't really have to weed it afterwards, and it's just, but so what Becky and I did some head scratching, and we tried out. We just purchased 3, I think 20-inch wavy coulters, and mounted those on a toolbar. And at first, I purchased these little fertilizer knives that could mount behind the coulter. My idea was that the coulter would slit the residue, and the fertilizer knife, it's just kind of a narrow piece of steel, really, behind the knife that I thought would maybe open the furrow just a little bit to be able to transplant into. And then we have this little toolbar that we can drive over the row, and it will cut 3 slits in the soil. We realized early on that the fertilizer knives get clogged on the residue, so it is. I would not advise attaching those behind, but a simple wavy coulter does a really great job of cutting through the residue and.
And you're going in it may not need to be said, but you're going in the same direction that you roll it.
Yes, exactly. Go in the same direction that the rye is rolled. And interestingly, too, even if the rye is lodged, like sometimes our rye will fall over when it's growing and it'll kind of be mostly in the same, when we flatten it, the rest of it gets pushed in the same direction. And so there is some variability. It's not all neat and tidy going in a straight line. But even when the rye is lodged, the slitting tool does a pretty good job of cutting through it. And so then it's what's neat about that is just the wavy coulter really does open the soil up just enough that we can transplant the way we normally do. On our scale, we go down and drop the transplants in the row, and someone else follows behind and tucks them in. And it is a little bit slower than transplanting on bare soil, but it's comparable.
Yeah. And do you think that part of the reason why that equipment works is that when you pull the tarp off, it's like pretty crispy generally?
I think, yeah, depending on how long the tarp is on, the crispier it is, the better. So if we're trying to get a really early transplant in and we tarp for a short time, the rye it is still a little bit more, it's less brittle, and the slitting tool will not do as good of a job. There's some more times where it will kind of make a slit, but instead of cutting through the rye will kind of get stuffed in the slit, which is, of course, less ideal. Longer tarping times, anytime if we're tarping for 4 weeks or so, it usually gets brittle enough to work really well.
And how much did that piece of equipment end up costing you at the end of the day?
I have that information somewhere, not on the top of my head. Around somewhere in the vicinity of $2,000, including hiring a metal worker to do the welding work for us.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure there's either pictures on your website, or I know there's pictures on the you were kind enough to be interviewed for the tarping guide that we did with the University of Maine, and I know there's pictures on that of your toolbar, and it's also like the trippiest toolbar I've ever seen. Did you do that, or
no?
Someone...
One of the folks who works with us came to our farm after a career as a self-employed artist, and so she's incredibly talented and makes all parts of our farm very beautiful, including this toolbar.
Yeah, it's a very lovely toolbar.
We sent her to the hardware store with $100 and told her to get any kind of spray paint she wanted, and she did an awesome job.
And so you were. The other question I wanted to ask was about what made some of that research possible, and you were part of this climate adaptation fellowship, which I believe is unique to the Northeast, but it's kind of a cool program. So if you could just give us a quick overview of what that is and how that has affected your farming.
Yeah, we were really lucky to be a part of that program, and it may even, I think I was heard recently that it may even be expanding its scope of operations beyond the Northeast. I don't know sure, but I think that's a possibility. That was a program that was developed by Rachel Chapman of the University of Maine, and was a really cool opportunity for our farm. The program works to educate farmers and technical advisors around the science of climate change globally and regionally. So I got to learn that science and begin to learn a little bit about the incredible amount of information that is known and modeled about the climate change projections for the Northeast. And the program also develops communication skills around climate change and communicating our perspective as farmers with the public. And I also got to work with a technical advisor. So I worked with Becky Madden from UVM Extension. And the program had funding support for Becky and I to work together mitigating climate risk on our farm. So that was how I was able to work with Becky on this, and it was an awesome program with a lot of great opportunities to do this work on my farm and to connect with other farmers doing similar climate adaptation work on their own operations.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I hope it is expanding because it seems like a really, really neat program. So final question, what are your goals going forward?
Oh, let's see. I mean, that is a good question.
It was your question, by the way.
It was my question.
Yeah.
Boy, well, I think one of my goals is really, we're at the end of the season, and I'm looking forward to the winter season to really sit down and take stock of this year and see where we want to go forward. I think it's kind of just like little improvements. We have, there's so much that is going really well with our farm, and there are so many opportunities for growth. But I think really the biggest goal going forward is to continue to work at making our farm a really great place for the people who work here and for our family, and to be able to have this farm meet our needs as much as possible in a way that doesn't take away from the long-term productivity of the long-term ability of this piece of land to meet the needs of future people who might be stewarding it.
Well, Ryan, I really appreciate talking with you. Your story is unique and really inspiring, and I have loved connecting with you over the high residue cover crop system. There's more information on that if anyone else is interested. So yeah, thank you and good luck.
Thanks, Natalie, and you can put my email in the show notes if anyone has any questions. I have a presentation that I made that spells out a lot of the details of what we've learned in the system, and if anyone is interested in trying it out, I'd be happy to forward it and maybe help someone avoid some of the little mistakes that we've learned from along the way.
Yeah, totally. I always try to present the good and the bad, and certainly it is possible to make mistakes, but you have done an awesome job, and it's really great to see you continue to use that. So, all right. Have a good holiday season and Happy New Year, too.
Thanks so much, Natalie.
Thanks for listening, everyone. That was super fun to talk with Ryan. And I haven't asked them yet if it's okay, but, Vermont's not that far from New Hampshire, so I'm thinking I might drop in next summer. Check out their farm. Sounds amazing. All right, bye.
Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here, just jumping in real quick to catch you up on some of what we have going on. We just finished up a weekend at the Organic Association of Kentucky conference here in Kentucky, all of 11 minutes away from my farm at the Kentucky State University Research Center. Not only was it a great conference, and I got to meet Nazirak Amen, who listeners will remember from previous seasons of the podcast, among other great folks that were there, but it was also the most convenient conference I've ever attended, so shout out to that. Also, our No-Till Growers YouTube channel will be kicking back to life again for another season of videos this month. If you have not checked out that channel, head to YouTube and subscribe. There are dozens and dozens of technical videos over there to check out. Speaking of checking stuff out, have you peeked at the new No-Till Growers forum yet over at no-tillgrowers.com? There are almost 1,100 or so growers over there now, maybe more by the time you hear this. So you can go and ask any growing questions that you have, and people like myself, but also a growing list of really excellent farmers will chime in, and without a bunch of snark or pretension like you sometimes find on other forums. There's no gatekeeping. It's just a forum for anyone of any level of experience or scale to enjoy. Like everything we do, that forum is free and open to the public. If you'd like to support our work or support the idea of keeping farming information free in general, you can pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook at no-tillgrowers.com or one of the no-till hats, which are back in stock. We've got merch there as well. The proceeds from those sales at no-tillgrowers.com go to supporting that work. If it's benefited you and you have the means to pitch in, that would be rad. Or even better, become a yearly or monthly Patreon member at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where not only may you get discounts on our stuff, but at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Sean at All About the Garden, Bill Altman, Ian at Grindstone Farms, Stephen Smith, and Oh High Roots. Huge shout out to everyone who supports our show in whatever way that you can. The Patreon page is the lifeblood of our work, so we hope you will hop on board over there. And that's it for me. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next week. Bye.